Hello. I'm going to take a few minutes to go over just a few things about storytelling, microfiction, which is kind of one of the focuses of this course, and revision. We're going to talk a little bit about some just basics about fiction and some differences between the traditional story and what we are working on in this class. And also talk about some strategies for looking at revision of your work. Basic elements of the story. Obviously, a story has to have a plot. This is your sequence of events from beginning to end. Story has to have characters. The people that are involved in the story, and lots of things can be characters. In science fiction, all sorts of things are characters. In Another element is setting. It's not just where the events take place, but also the sounds, smells, sights, anything that kind of changes the narrative arc. It doesn't just give us the feel of the story, but it is a part of telling that story. The language of your story is also very important. It's not really just about your grammar and punctuation, but careful word choice, your style, your tone of voice, the dialogue, all those things are a part of the language and sets a story apart one from another. Traditional stories, because they don't conform to a particular kind of length, they can have a lot of setup material, background, character development. They can take pages and pages to describe a person or lots of material about a character's backstory, as it were. But in flash fiction, we don't have very much setup, if any. A lot of times, a flash fiction story feels like it starts in the middle or just at the very end of the actual narrative. Traditional stories often have many characters, some very important, some less important, but a flash fiction piece generally has one or two characters, not a whole lot. A traditional story can have lots of different story arcs where we're moving around, different characters doing different things, and each person's actions affecting another person's actions. But flash fiction typically only will cover one story arc, one particular character and what happens to her or him. When we look at a plot, when we talk about a plot, we want to revise that story. We want to ask ourselves some really important questions. One of the most important to me is, does this plot sound like a report? If it just feels like an outline being read to me, then it's probably not going to be engaging for a reader. What in the story needs to be made clearer? Constantly telling students what's clear in your head is not clear in mine, and it may mean adding a piece of description, a sentence, or maybe cutting something that is just confusing for the reader. Are there any holes in the story? Is there anything that's left out that the writer has clear in her head or his head, and the reader doesn't have any place or way to jump over that? Where can you make your transitions clearer or better? That is, when you move from one part of the story to the next part of the story, do you need something to help your reader bridge that gap? Do you have material that isn't directly related to the story? You've gone off topic, or that you've added something perhaps that should be cut, or oftentimes it doesn't need to be cut entirely, but merely condensed. Take a paragraph that gives some important information, but doesn't necessarily need to be so verbose, and so you can condense it to a single well-written sentence. Another good question is, what were you afraid to put in the first draft? Was there anything that you held back on for some reason or another? Revising characters and dialogue. Good questions here are, do I need to say more about the people in my story? Have I left out anything about them? Or have I told too much? Lots of times we tell too much. Can the reader see and hear them? That is, mentally, does the reader have a good, strong sense of what that person, not necessarily the literal appearance, but can we see what they're doing? Can we hear what they're doing? Can we hear their dialogue? Can we hear their tone of voice? Can we understand kind of who they are from the bare essentials that we have in a flash fiction story? Do I tell people about important conversations, or do I give them the actual conversation? Lots of first drafts will have a sentence that says something like, and then they talked about their life together. Well, why not just give us a little bit of that actual conversation? How can I make my dialogue sound authentic? That is, how do I make it sound like real people talk? Lots of times, particularly students will try to sound really impressive, or they will try to use large words, or they will use language that the character would never ever use, make the dialogue sound like a real person. Description is very, very important, and in flash fiction, it's incredibly important because we can't spend a lot of space on that description. So you can ask yourself, what needs to be added to make an important object clearer or more vivid? If a car is an important part of the story, what do we need to make that car more mentally present? Have I described unimportant people, places, and objects and given little space to those that are crucial to my story? It's easy to get a minor character in your story and spend lots of energy on that person or that thing, and then we realize that we've given not much space, not much time, not much detail to the important people, to the important objects. What do the important places in the story look like, sound like, feel like, smell like? Again, we have to be very precise in our description so that we get a real good sense without spending lots and lots of sentences on them. Do you tell the reader what your feelings are? Do you actually give the reader descriptions, sensory details? Telling the reader what to feel kind of cheats the reader out of the experience. But if you give very precise description and details, you can really help that reader see what's going on. The language level writing is not, as I said about errors, but one of the first things you have to do is look for and correct errors that you commonly make. I think most writers, after practicing for a little bit, kind of know themselves, and so they can figure out, I have a tendency to put too many fragments, or I use this kind of word too often. One thing you can do to help yourself is to read your essay or paper out loud, your story out loud, or have it read to you so you hear what it sounds like in the ear, in the mental ear of the reader. Wherever you use cliches, wherever you use very stale language that's just kind of flat, where can you be precise? How have you been precise and careful with your word choices? Lots of times we put a word because that's the word we think of as we draft, but when we revise, you might see what things need to be much more precise. Have you been careful to have a tone which invites your reader and does not alienate the reader? Anytime you kind of put the reader off, there better be a darn good reason to do it. Is your tone consistent? If it changes throughout the story, you really need to have a real good reason for that, and the reader should be able to follow that. Again, where do you need precise words to communicate your thoughts? So, where do we go from here? Whether we're born to write epic novels, memoirs, lyric poems, or reports for someone in charge, The practice of writing microfiction helps us to compose short assignments, as Anne Lamott used to call them, or still calls them, which can be pieced together toward a bigger whole. Uh, I think it helps us to focus on the specific and to make the specific more meaningful. It's one reason I like to teach microfiction and encourage students to write them, whether they feel particularly creative or not. You can see that it can hopefully help in lots of different ways. Thank you.